I got these going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I'll be one of your hosts today, and I am here with Taylor. But before we let Taylor into the conversation, we have 3 new patrons to shout out. So we would like to say thank you to Zachary, Norman, and, of course, Daddy Bongo. So thank you for your support on Patreon. We really do appreciate the support that we get over there. Just encourages us to branch out, make a variety of things over there that we really enjoy. We tend to have a bit more fun with those Patreon episodes, with the exception of our last one. Not a fun episode. It was informative and I think an important episode for us to do. That was about a longitudinal study on the parents of children killed in the sinking of the Sewol ferry in South Korea. Most of our episodes are not like that on Patreon. Most of them are a lot more fun. We talk about movies and books and all kinds of other stuff that is ship related. I think our next movie episode, we're going to watch Midway. Is that right?
Yeah, the old Midway, not the... whatever.
Well, I was thinking, like, the new Midway might make a better episode. Not a better movie, but probably a better episode. So we'll see. We'll watch.
The old one, actually, I think, is a good movie.
Well, yeah, it's a classic.
I think it holds up as, like, an actual good movie today.
I think the new one was...
I think there's a Jonas brother.
He plays Chuichi Nagumo, which is weird.
Yeah, it's really a weird casting choice, but...
Controversial in 2019. So speaking of media, what have you been up to?
Oh, let's see. I've been reading. I decided to read something a little lighter, which of course I got through really quick. But I read The League, How 5 Rivals Created the NFL and Launched a Sports Empire by John Eisenberg. And it's actually really good. He focuses on like 5 of the key figures that were in the NFL, kind of from like the beginning to like its transition to being the beginnings of what it is today, basically.
The 5 families, if you will.
Yeah, the 5 families. And so it's George Hollis, who's the band. Tim Mara is the Giants. George Marshall is the Washington football team, aka at the time, the Red. Burt Bell is the Eagles, and Art Rooney, of course, the best of the owners, the Steelers.
I will bleep out. I will also bleep out Bear because
It's a really good book, though. It's you kind of see that they all brought something to the table. George Marshall of the Redskins brought racism for real. Like he actually was the last team to integrate.
Well, see, and that's the thing with the Washington, now the team that we would call the Commanders, is that people have been like, oh, it's just a name, it's just a logo. It's like, no, it's actually pretty baked into the franchise.
He was actually even racist by like 1940 standards. It was really interesting though, hearing how much Burt Bell did, like not as an owner, but as a commissioner, and how he wasn't even like a great owner necessarily, but he was like the absolute perfect guy having that commissioner role. It's cool seeing how Art Rooney was kind of the outsider who had kind of could make deals between the new owners and like the old money owners and stuff. So it's a really cool look at that. That's an interesting time period of the NFL. And then since I read a happy book, I decided I had to go back to reading a not happy book. I just started yesterday, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich by Sir Richard J. Evans.
That sounds like a series that would come on the American Heroes channel now.
It does. This is actually a new release. So it's kind of like, at first it's really easy to be like, oh, what new could be written about Hitler? But this kind of is like the guy to write the book, I would say. Like he wrote a pretty definitive 3-part World War II account and everything at one point. Yeah. He's actually the academic advisor to the guy who wrote another one of the books that I read recently, KL, about the extermination camps. So this would be the guy to write like a new book about Hitler. But it's cool. He breaks it down first, like through like the Hitler level, then through his inner circle, then through people who were party officials, and then through like a normal German, like their eyes. So he even says like you can read it like just one of those sections and get a complete story, but you can also read all 4 to see how and why those outcomes happen. So sort of an expansion on the books like Ordinary Men, and things like that. What about you?
Reading wise, I've started into the third and final entry in Ian Toll's Pacific trilogy. It's Twilight of the Gods, War in the Western Pacific, 1944 to 1945.
We're both on a World War II kick.
Yeah, I want to knock out this trilogy. Still very good. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. It's amazing how jam-packed this last volume is, though, with the big names that
everything you know about the Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, it's got Peleliu, it's got Iwo Jima, it's got Okinawa. Obviously, it's got the atomic bombs. But yeah, it's a lot to get through in this one. It is also by far the longest of the trilogy.
It is interesting how much of all the hits get played at once in the Pacific.
Also, with the new Alien movie coming out, I was thinking about it, and I realized that I haven't seen any of the recent Alien movies. None of the ones that have come out in the 2000s, except for the Alien versus Predator movies. And so, in order to most thoroughly enjoy that movie, I am starting from the beginning of the Alien franchise and watching one movie a day. So that this Saturday I can watch. What's it called? Romulus?
Yes. Which actually, I guess that could be my bonus item. Because you saw that last night.
You saw that also.
Yes. And I've only seen like the first one.
Yeah. And like I had seen the first one like a long time ago.
It did not hinder my enjoyment of this one.
I know I'd seen the second one at some point and then bits of the others because they probably came on TV around each other. And so I was more or less familiar with those. But I know I've like never seen Prometheus or Covenant. So tonight in my watch/rewatch, I am on to Alien Resurrection, the fourth one that I'm going to be checking out.
Yeah, it was good. It inspired me to want to like watch the rest of them.
The early ones, especially, I really enjoyed. I think Alien 3 might be my favorite on the prison planet.
Interesting.
But
I know I haven't seen that one.
Charles Dance is really good in that. Tywin Lannister for Game of Thrones people. So yeah, I'm enjoying those. I've been doing pod work while watching those.
Nice.
We'll see if it influences my writing style. So this week we are going to what I think is a new city for the podcast. We're going to Baltimore, Maryland.
AKA the worst city in the AFC North.
Cleveland is also in the AFC North.
It's better. It's on a Great Lake, at least.
I mean, some people would say, well, Cincinnati's in the... Well, some people would say that about Pittsburgh also. So I guess it's kind of a race to the bottom. Surely we've mentioned Baltimore for some reason at some point, but it's going to be the feature of today's presentation. I know both of us have been to Baltimore, but for me, at least, that was a long, long time ago. Have you been to Baltimore since then?
No, I don't believe so.
It was like 25 years ago, it would have been. We visited with our grandparents. Do you remember anything about Baltimore?
I remember riding a water taxi.
Yeah, we're going to ride one of those today here.
I remember Fort McHenry. And I remember eating at somewhere in the Inner Harbor that charged you by the glass for Coke. And that was offensive to our grandparents. I also remember going to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum.
Now that I don't remember.
Yeah. Yep. Right over by like Camden Yards, I believe.
I remember walking by Camden Yards. I wasn't really watching baseball actively at that time, but that would have been like late 90s. I was aware of baseball, Barry Bonds, Sammy Sosa, people like that. Glorious summer of home runs and nothing bad ever happened.
No, it was great.
I also remember the aquarium. They have a really cool aquarium.
I don't remember the aquarium.
Yeah, see, I think, did you go to the museum while I went to the aquarium or something?
I doubt it. I feel like
I remember seeing the USS Constellation, not the Constitution, right?
Yes.
I think the Constitution's in Boston?
Yeah, Constellation.
Okay. I do remember seeing that. So we've patched together a vision of Baltimore
that isn't based around The Wire.
I've never actually seen The Wire.
I haven't either. I just know that when people talk about Baltimore, they talk about The Wire.
So yes, we are in Baltimore. Of course, the most recent big Baltimore story related to ships was the Francis Scott Key Bridge being struck and partially collapsed by, what was it, a container ship? I think it was.
Yeah, it was a container ship.
That is not what we're talking about today. Baltimore probably isn't in the top tier of American cities that outsiders are familiar with.
At least today, I feel like it played a much bigger role in the early part of American history.
Kind of like Cincinnati in that regard.
Yeah, a lot like, kind of like the AFC North in general, actually.
Mm-hmm. Despite that, it has a very key role in American history as the site of Fort McHenry, famously besieged by the British during the War of 1812. Francis Scott Key, of bridge fame, he was an American and he was on board a British ship during the bombardment of Fort McHenry, which prompted him to write a poem called Defense of Fort McHenry, part of which is now used as the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key also very famously spoke out against slavery while owning slaves. So, yeah, little American hypocrisy there for you. I think he's a classic American hero in that regard.
How Alexander Hamilton of him.
Fort McHenry actually does play a supporting role in today's episode. The fort is one of the main tourist attractions for visitors to Baltimore. I don't know numbers wise, but it probably is the tourist attraction that many people know from Baltimore. It's, defending the mouth of the harbor, hence why it was being bombarded. And to reach the fort from the inner harbor kind of downtown waterfront area, many people use one of Baltimore's water taxis. And it's one of these water taxis that is the subject of today's episode. You and I have ridden on a water taxi.
Correct.
Maybe it was the Lady D. Who knows? Timing-wise, it easily could have been.
Yeah, it is very close.
It quite literally could have been. I mean, we were probably there in, 1997 or 98?
Yeah.
Maybe we've been on this one. Today's story concerns the Lady D, a Baltimore water taxi built in 1996 for Baltimore Harbor Shuttle LLC. Lady D was 36 feet in length and measured 8 feet in beam. She was the third in a series of 4 boats that would be built to these dimensions for Baltimore Harbor Shuttle. Quoting here from the accident reports.
The first boat in the series, the Fells Point Princess, was built by an individual in his backyard. And the following 3 in the series, the Raven, the Lady D, and the Misty Harbor 2, were built by Susquehanna Santee Boat Works. After the Lady D was launched in March 1996, Baltimore Harbor Shuttle operated it as a water taxi in Baltimore Harbor. In 2000, Living Classrooms, the parent company of Seaport Taxi, purchased the Baltimore Harbor Shuttle fleet, and the Lady D continued to operate in the Baltimore Harbor area, primarily on Seaport Taxi's outer loop between Fells Point and Fort McHenry.
In 2003, the year prior to our incident today, Seaport Taxi reported that they had transported 200,000 paying customers around the Baltimore Harbor area, just as an idea of how many people they're moving around here. As a bit of a geographical note, Baltimore is located on the Patapsco River at the northern end of Chesapeake Bay. So that river kind of forms the different parts of Baltimore Harbor.
I always forget how close Baltimore and Washington, D.C. are.
Yeah, they're all jammed in there together. You're going to hear mention of Fells Point a few times. Mm-hmm. Fells Point is a spot. It's located a little bit down the waterfront from the kind of inner harbor area where the historical ships and such are. So it's a little bit east of that. Lady D was constructed mostly from marine-grade aluminum, including the boat's 2 pontoons, hull, and deckhouse. The boat's deckhouse was 24 feet by 7 feet 8 inches, with a canopy over the top measuring 7 feet high at the sides and 7 feet 6 inches at its highest point.
I love that this was built in someone's backyard.
Well, the first one was.
Yeah. Like this was, I should say, this was designed in someone's backyard.
And I don't know what that means. They don't really explain it, but so you mean that this guy just built it and then you used it to transport passengers?
Like there has to be some sort of certification process, right?
Kind of, but that's going to come later. Quote here from the report. The sides of the deckhouse each had a waist-high bulkhead above which were 6 slider windows having 1 fixed sash and 1 sliding sash. Each window sash measured 42 inches high and 24 inches wide. I think it's never really a good thing when we have to point out how big the windows are.
Yeah, generally not.
When that's a factor that matters. There were 2 doors to the deckhouse, one forward and one aft. The forward door was the main access to the deckhouse for passengers and crew entering and exiting. The aft door was primarily used for crew access to the outboard motor, but the aft door could also be used for egress in an emergency. And that's the wording from the report, that it could be used for egress. I don't know if this was visibly designated as an emergency exit.
Right.
Or if it was designated as such during their emergency briefing, that they're supposed to do before they set off.
The thing that everyone ignores usually.
Right. Again, that'll be a factor here too, maybe. Seating for passengers consisted of 2 benches along the port and starboard sides of the deckhouse. So your backs are to the side of the, of the boat.
Like facing inward.
The operator console was located forward of the starboard bench, while the mate typically stood in a position to the port and slightly aft of the master. Maximum listed capacity of the Lady D was 25 people, 23 passengers, and 2 crew. This will be important later. This will probably be the most important thing later. How many people are on this? The Lady D had a top speed of 12 knots, but the master stated that his standard operating speed was 6 knots, as these operations happened within a no-wake zone where 6 knots was the limit.
That makes sense. I mean, you're literally just operating right there in the harbor.
No one needs to get to Fort McHenry that fast. And this brings us to March 6th, 2004. Around 11 a.m. that morning, Lady D entered into her routine service on the outer loop route between Fells Point and Fort McHenry. She ran her routes that day with no issues until around 3:45, when she arrived at the pier next to Fort McHenry to bring visitors back to Fells Point. The fort coordinator opened the gate and allowed passengers to board the Lady D. In accordance with the boat's certification, 23 passengers were allowed on, in addition to the 2 crew, for a total of 25 individuals aboard the Lady D. 2 remaining couples were not allowed to board due to this capacity limit.
Mm-hmm.
The master of the Lady D planned to return to the fort and pick the remaining passengers up after this group had been successfully dropped off at Fells Point. So they got to spend a little bit more time at the fort.
Nothing bad's going to happen then, right? Because they listened to the rules.
Absolutely. So of the passengers on board, there were 3 children, ages 6, 7, and 8. The 20 adults ranged in age from 23 to 60.
I want to be the 23-year-old, if anyone, in this situation.
Maybe not, because we'll see the distribution here. Also, the upper range here, I'm not 100% confident, because at some points in the report, it mentions a passenger age 62. Either 60 or 62, one of these passengers. The master of the Lady D was 74 years old. He'd received his U.S. Merchant Marine officer license in 2002, which authorized him to serve for 5 years as master of steam or motor vessels not exceeding 50 gross registered tons on inland waters.
74 does feel kind of old.
Well, I was interested here because this is a bit like it's a bit of a part-time second career for this person. He's hired as a part-time employee in summer of 2002, which is his first job in the maritime industry. He had been boating since 1995, when he got his first boat. He mostly worked weekends, though he would sometimes work a full-time schedule during summer peak season. And he was reportedly very adept at handling this style of boats, like the Lady D, these pontoon boats.
But he was not like a lifelong sailor or anything?
No. The crew's actions don't really factor into it here.
Mm-hmm.
He's reported as being very good, one of the best in the fleet of handling these particular boats, to the extent that they don't even want to train him on the bigger ones because he is very good with these, and then they'd have to train someone to fill his spot.
Gotcha.
They could be particularly tricky in the wind. These are not super heavy vessels, but they do have these deck houses and canopies, so they can be tricky to maneuver. The mate on Lady D was 55, and he had been hired as a seasonal employee in May 2003. He received his U.S. Merchant Marine Officer license in November 2003. So this is a case where we have both master and mate could have essentially switched spots.
Yeah, it's like when you see like first officers on a flight deck that have like the licensing to be a captain, they just choose not to, basically.
Yeah, so this is an instance where experience, or rather qualification, is not in question here. Both of these are qualified to operate this vehicle. Lady D left Fort McHenry at 3:54, and the master broadcasted a message to the fleet and fort coordinator that they were underway. I don't know if I mentioned it. The fort coordinator is a seaport taxi employee who is stationed at Fort McHenry to coordinate with how many people are getting on to these.
Okay, I wasn't
boats.
sure if that was like a parks person whose job it is
No,
to
that is
know who's there.
Yeah, that is a seaport taxi person who essentially operates kind of the pier.
Okay.
Getting people on and off, and they're recording numbers of who's getting on, how many are getting on. Federal regulations would require at this point for a safety briefing to be given. But from the analysis portion of the NTSB report,
the safety board received conflicting accounts about whether a safety briefing was performed at the outset of the accident voyage. The master and the mate both told investigators that a safety announcement advising passengers about the location of life jackets was performed. However, most of the Lady D survivors either could not recall receiving a safety briefing on board the Lady D or stated the crew did not conduct one. Almost all survivors said they had received a safety briefing on other seaport taxi vessels at Harbor Place for the trip to Fells Point.
So this is kind of one of the big uncertainties from this story, is whether or not the safety briefing was given. Now, even if it had been given, that's not a guarantee that that's going to save everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting because both master and mate say that they did, and none of the passengers corroborate that. Some of them say they don't remember. Some of them explicitly say no, they did not give one on this trip back. Given the weather situation we're going to talk about here, that might be some support to the idea that if they're in a rush to get this boat going and get back to Fells Point, maybe they skipped it.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you guys heard this on the way out.
Right. I don't think we have any specific way to ever know 100%, but that makes sense to me, at least.
I feel like this is a great example of why airlines don't leave it up to you to remember it. It's like you just know that they do it because they don't want people to be able to be like, well, I didn't know what to do. It's like you just chose not to listen.
Yeah.
I've never, have you ever been on a flight where you didn't have the safety briefing? No, you haven't.
At the same time, I can imagine from the passenger's point of view, especially if you've been writing these things multiple times throughout the day or throughout the week, they probably all run together. And then, of course, the one that has this accident, maybe in your head you go, well, did they give us a safety briefing? Maybe they did, and maybe
especially when it's not like you're trying to remember it as it's happening.
Exactly. So yeah, it's kind of up in the air there. The master noted that as they were pulling away from the pier, the wind began to pick up.
The weather started getting rough.
This tiny boat is going to be tossed. In addition to the wind, he recalled seeing dark clouds west of the city, but neither master nor mate said that lightning was visible at the time. Shortly after this, it began to rain and the weather rapidly deteriorated, with increasing winds and lightning.
That 3-letter combination, how often do we hear that?
That's kind of our thing, so.
WRD.
That'd be a good t-shirt.
It would be.
A radio message went out from Seaport Taxi's senior captain on the water, advising all vessels currently in service to pull ashore and tie up until the storm passed. However, shortly after this, the Seaport Taxi office manager radioed, saying that the heaviest of the storm would not be affecting the area of boat operation.
So some asshole in the office is like, looks fine to me.
Sort of. There's more to it. We'll talk about the forecast itself. There's criticism that comes down on that. On being told that Lady D had already left the fort, the senior captain suggested heading to the Baltimore Marine Center or Henderson's Wharf.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, is you're a few minutes from somewhere that you can get safely and tie
there's plenty
up.
of places here that you could go in and tie up. Passengers recalled that as Lady D moved further out into the channel, she began to roll in the waves. And just a reminder here, I didn't include specific notes about this. As a pontoon boat, there's actually quite a lot of detail about the stability calculations and wind heel moments, things like that, center of gravity, center of buoyancy, all this stuff. Talking about how pontoon boats, if you've ever been on a pontoon boat, one of the nice things is that they're quite stable. You know, you've got the two pontoons, and it's pretty hard to tip one of them over. They have pretty good staying. They're pretty good at staying upright. But once they do hit that tipping point, they're not going to come back. Like they lose that buoyancy very, very quickly once that happens. So for one of these to start rocking really, really badly, that's not going to be very comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, like it is really hard to tip one of those over, but once it goes, it goes.
The master struggled to handle the vessel in the wind, being pushed backwards from where he was attempting to take the vessel to the Marine Center. This is kind of right across from where Fort McHenry is.
Which is like a pretty narrow part, too. Sort of a choke point almost.
Yeah, it's all a fairly condensed area here. You know, we're not dealing with huge distances. In the words of one passenger who was seated on the port side of the boat,
the wind came across our back and keeled us up. The people on the starboard side, immediately out of instinct, came over to try and right the boat, and it helped some. The master brought the boat around into the wind to level the boat out.
With the boat leveled out, the mate instructed passengers to return to the starboard benches. Passengers reported that he nervously added that life jackets were under the benches.
What does that sound like?
I'm imagining kind of like a nervous, or kind of like a almost flipping life jackets are under the benches.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted that too.
Type of thing. The kind of thing you say when you don't think it's actually going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Only moments later, the Lady D heeled quickly back to starboard and capsized at 3:58, with the capsizing sequence lasting just a few seconds, according to passengers.
It's interesting how quick this one is compared to a lot of the other.
Yeah, kind of like I was saying a few minutes ago with when you have kind of your classic mono-hull type vessel, it may capsize a bit more slowly and then hit that tipping point and go all the way over. But with one of these, if it's going to go very fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this, the Lady D, this water taxi, has capsized out in the middle of the harbor. But a small silver lining here, the Lady D's struggles, even before she capsized, did not go unnoticed. Right next to Fort McHenry is a U.S. Navy Reserve Center. Reservists who'd been watching the craft in the harbor immediately called 911 and reported that she had overturned. So they see her struggling in the wind. At one point, one of them even notes that he thought she was traveling in the opposite direction from where she was actually going because she was getting pushed so hard in the wind. These reservists were from Detachment 106, Fleet and Industrial Supply Center, Norfolk, and they were on drill status at the center. I don't know if they were actively drilling at the time or if not. But regardless,
they were probably all happy that it was like raining and storming, so they didn't have to drill.
And so this I think is the cool part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
A mechanized landing craft, an LCM-8, was launched with 19 reservists aboard, and they made for the site of the stricken Lady D.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see that kind of response. And, you'd expect the Navy to do it, obviously, but they're also they aren't Coast Guard. They aren't.
Yeah, this is not
inherently
this is not
trained
even
to do this.
Yeah, this is something that I guess on the one hand, you'd be like, yes, you'd expect it. But on the other hand, not really, not technically. It's not in the job description necessarily. While this is happening, the 911 call is being relayed to Baltimore City Fire Department. Fire Department was already aware, as the crew of a fireboat in the harbor had witnessed the accident as well. 43 rescue and medical personnel were dispatched to assist.
It's pretty wild how many people saw this happen. How many first responder types saw this happen.
Well, and that is the thing here. This is a busy area. There's going to be a lot of eyes on the harbor. So yeah, you do fortunately have a lot of witnesses to this who can jump into action. Baltimore police patrol officers were dispatched to Fort McHenry, to determine how many people had been aboard the boat when it left the fort.
Thanks for your help.
Got to find something for the cops to do. Counting is something that they know how to do. The reservists in the LCM-8 were first on scene, arriving at 4:06, about 8 minutes after capsizing. Not bad for...
Not expecting to do it?
Yeah, having to do this by surprise, get some guys together to jump out and go do this.
Does it note like what the weather's like at this point? Is it over pretty quick afterwards, or is it still stormy?
It's fairly rough still. I think it did pass relatively quickly, but I believe the winds are still pretty high.
Okay.
On reaching the site, reservists noted that around the overturned pontoon boat were a large number of life jackets floating freely around the craft. Most of the passengers had climbed atop the hull of the Lady D, while 2 were still in the water holding onto the boat. Something I will note here is, talking about the emergency briefing and whatnot. Whether or not that was delivered, the passengers had at least somewhat retained enough of that knowledge or had the foreknowledge to know not to don the life jacket inside the closed deck house. Because these life jackets have been taken out, from where they're stored, but they haven't been put on. So you can see that there's at least some awareness of what you would want in an emergency situation here. Most of the passengers had climbed atop the hull of the Lady D, while 2 were still in the water holding on to the boat. Water temperature, I believe, was around 44 degrees. Several of the Navy reservists jumped into the water to help with the rescue. Some of these Navy personnel wore life jackets, while one who entered the water without one was able to grab one of the floating jackets from Lady D and use it for himself. And here is where the Navy reservists really shine in the story.
Upon learning that passengers were still trapped inside the water taxi, reservists untied the lines holding the vessels together and lowered the LCM-8's loading ramp into the water and used it as a lever to raise one side of the capsized water taxi. Witnesses said this action freed 3 trapped passengers, including 2 adult women and a little girl.
I don't know if that's something that they're taught. It's hey, you can do this in an emergency, or if that's something that they came up with on the spot. But it was very well executed.
I feel like this is one of those things where having the wrong equipment might have worked out.
Because, yeah, if this is something that was just off the cuff, this is genius. Because it does what they need it to do. It just lifts this up so that they can extricate these people trapped under the boat, rather than having to say, swim down under, hope that there's a big enough air pocket and get people back out.
And I feel like it's cool, though. It's one thing to conceptualize that, but it's another to actually confidently be able to do that and not, trap someone under your boat.
Even if this is something, say, that they know about or they've practiced before, even to have to do it in such a real life situation, that's pretty cool. All of the survivors had been taken from the water by the time the Coast Guard arrived on scene. So this also happens really fast. They're able to get people out of the water extremely fast once they get there.
How much shit talking do you think there was from the Navy Reserve guys?
Yeah, it's you guys weren't even here.
Fact.
Well, thanks for showing up, boys. I think we've got things handled here. Overall, 22 of the vessel's occupants were taken to shore within a half hour of the incident. One passenger died shortly after being removed from the water. I couldn't tell if this was at the site or if they had gotten to the hospital. Another passenger, who was actually that first passenger's daughter, would die 2 days later at Harbor Hospital. So that was a mother and daughter pair.
Were these drownings or hypothermia? What are we?
So ultimately there will be 5 deaths out of this, all of which will be listed as drowning complicated by hypothermia. The report does go into quite a bit of detail of the physical effects of hypothermia, and then also I don't know if it's hydrostatic pressure is the right word for it, but the way that sort of being in the water like that, the pressure from the water compresses your body, and it sort of helps your body keep your core warm. And so when you're taken out of the water and that blood flow returns to its normal flow, that can actually cause a drop in your core temperature. So a lot of deaths, or I don't know about a lot, but it is possible that these, deaths from hypothermia can happen immediately after someone comes out of the water, because they no longer have that sort of homeostasis that their body's trying to keep.
Right.
There's a lot better.
Hypothermia is a weird thing.
There's a lot better description in the full report there on those. So a third passenger was seriously injured and needed long-term medical care. 3 of the Lady D's passengers were not recovered from the water on the day of the sinking, but all 3 of those bodies were recovered from the harbor about a week after the accident. 2 of them on March 14th. This was a 6-year-old and a 26-year-old male. And one on March 15th. This is a 26-year-old female, the fiance of the 26-year-old male. Those names are available. They're in the articles that we'll have in the show notes.
I don't suppose like they have this, but what I'd be interested is like a seating chart of like who survived and who didn't and where they were seated. That's one thing that's interesting in all of like the I've been on an airline disaster kick lately on Wikipedia, and like it's always so interesting looking at sometimes how random and then sometimes how not random those charts are.
Yeah, we do know this actually, and this is not random. All of the deceased from this accident were seated near the middle of the boat, so furthest away from both of the exit doors. So yeah, there is a definite correlation there between who was able to get out in time and who wasn't. Because the deck house of the boat was mostly torn off, they're not sure if the ones who died were able to get out first, or if they went, down with, if they drowned before they even made it out of the deck house.
Right.
Like I said, cause of death for all of them was listed as drowning complicated by hypothermia, which I'm assuming to mean drowning due to the physical effects of hypothermia.
Loss of like motor functions.
Yeah, you start to shut down. You can't swim. You can't keep yourself above water because your body is trying to keep all that blood in your core. 4 passengers sustained serious injuries during the sinking or medical events in the aftermath that required hospitalization. 12 sustained minor cuts, bruises, abrasions, stuff like that. So getting into the investigation and aftermath, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So first off, let's look at the weather. We know that was a factor in the sinking.
Mm-hmm.
The Seaport Taxi's company procedures for inclement weather put a lot of trust in the judgment of the boat's master. So that's not out of the ordinary for any of our topics, really.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, a ship's captain is trusted with the decision of, your ship.
But that's one of the perks of being a captain of a vessel, is you're in charge of it.
This is yours. You know what you're doing. You have the qualifications. So this is kind of up to you. The report cites Seaport Taxi director as saying, quote, "If masters encountered an electrical storm, restricted visibility, fog, or another condition that in their experience would dictate finding a safe harbor." Oh, I didn't finish the quote, but they're instructed to take the boat in and tie up.
He also told investigators that he did not want to hamper independent decisions out there because what's happening in the inner harbor may be totally different than what's happening out at Fort McHenry, or conversely. It's their judgment, it's their license, and I would expect that courtesy when I'm running a boat. And that's the same courtesy I give them.
There were 3 criteria in the company's stated weather policy that would require masters to bring their vessels in and tie up. This is dramatically reduced visibility, if lightning is sighted in the vicinity, or when the wind is over 30 to 35 knots, depending on the route. So those are the things they're saying, okay, this is a cut and dry situation where you need to not operate this boat.
Right.
In the event that a master reported being uncomfortable with conditions, they could radio the company and arrangements could be made for a heavier boat to run the route. So there were situations where some of these boats were not quite as powerful as the others. And so captain could radio, say, hey, I don't think, I don't think Lady D can handle the outer loop today. And, maybe they can bring her in to run the other route.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's a good way to shuffle your resources and work with what you get.
And the master of the Lady D had actually done this earlier in the year, which I think is important because it shows that, yes, there's precedent for this to happen and that this specific captain is willing to make use of that option.
Mm-hmm.
He's not shy about saying, hey, I don't think this vessel can do this today, or I don't feel comfortable operating this vessel here today in these conditions. The master of Lady D stated to investigators that he typically checked the weather channel before leaving for work, and that the March 6th forecast didn't indicate that there would be such severe wind in the harbor. There was some weather-related criticism, however. Quoting here from the analysis section of the report,
The meteorologists at the Baltimore, Washington forecast office were slow to respond to evidence of intense storm conditions until the lead forecaster noticed a high wind reading, 46 knots, at 1544 at Reagan Washington National Airport. However, their own system data that were available at their workstations had provided sufficient information to have warranted their issuing a special marine warning before the Lady D embarked passengers at the dock near Fort McHenry at 1552.
The report concludes the weather section by saying, quote, "The weather information available to Seaport Taxi at the time of the accident did not accurately reflect the impending storm conditions, which compromised efforts to adhere to safe operating procedures." So if we go back to when we sort of blamed the office person for giving them bad information, it's partially because the office person did not have all of the best information.
This is sort of the opposite of the Alfaro, where they had all the information.
Sort of, yeah.
It.
Well, and what's interesting here is that this actually comes down from, this is actually the National Weather Service itself that is issuing some of these critiques of their local office here, making this call.
Interesting.
So this is not just the NTSB saying, hey, this wasn't right. This is the Weather Service itself saying, hey, like, we should have been issuing this order or, this warning when we saw XYZ conditions. And that didn't happen. Drugs, alcohol, sleep deprivation, and physical impairment were all ruled out by subsequent testing and investigations. Maintenance was determined not to have been a contributing factor to the sinking. She had had routine maintenance done, but nothing out of the ordinary. There was no recorded damage to the vessel before the incident. The only damage found to the pontoon after the wreckage was recovered was deemed to have been caused by the ramp from the landing craft.
Interesting. Okay, so not like any neglect or anything like that necessarily.
Right. These, and as I believe it was the company director kind of saying, like, yes, they were routinely inspected, before they go out every day. We had, the masters go over them, make sure everything was working. They're simple vessels. I mean, there's not a lot to them. So there's not really as much that can go wrong. None of those seem to have been issues. And so the investigation settled largely on the issue of Lady D's stability. So the report goes into quite a lot of detail, a lot of math, a lot of calculations about stability testing. And it's really interesting, but I'm not good enough with math to functionally explain all of it. So the pontoon/passenger simplified stability test, or PSST, the one that was used pre-2005 at the time of this sinking, used only a calculation for passenger heel in the proof test. So just saying, what is the passenger weight distribution that will tip this thing over?
So it's not accounting for wind or conditions?
There was no consideration of wind heel for pontoon vessels. So in the standard stability tests for a monohull vessel, that was considered because, thinking that, well, the wind can more greatly affect one of these types of craft. And this is explained. Why is there no consideration of wind for pontoon vessels? This is explained in the analysis portion of the report.
Unlike the SST for monohull vessels, the original PSST, developed by the Coast Guard, did not include a wind heel condition. Though the Coast Guard acknowledges that it no longer has documentation to explain the genesis of the PSST, officials indicated that they thought an exception to the wind heel conditions had been made for pontoon vessels because early vessels, as designed, did not carry canopies or deck houses. Under those circumstances, passenger heel rather than wind heel was the more critical stability test.
So the idea here being that when these early stability specifications were made, no one was really thinking about what you could do with a pontoon vessel in terms of building it up. Thinking these are going to sit fairly low in the water. It's going to matter a lot more what you have on this than it is the wind. But as regards the Lady D, all of these stability certification requirements are basically immaterial because she was never herself certified for stability.
You don't have to follow the rules if you just don't pretend like there are any.
And so this is interesting because it's one of those things where it's like cheating the system, but no one really tried to. It's
accidentally like committing tax fraud.
It is a lot of people overlooking details, and then suddenly here we are. So we'll go to the incident report to see why and how this happened. As a reminder, the first vessel in that series, the Fells Point Princess, the one that was built in the guy's backyard or whatever, it had been built and tested in 1992.
According to Coast Guard officials, field notes indicate that the test was not conducted in accordance with the PSST protocol contained in the Marine Safety Manual, but rather in accordance with CG 4006, a simplified stability test form, or job aid, that was applicable to monohull vessels.
In the SST for monohull vessels, both a wind healing moment and a passenger healing moment are calculated. The larger of the two moments is then applied to the vessel by shifting weights a distance necessary to achieve that moment.
A review of the test form shows that during the stability proof testing of the Fells Point Princess, the passenger healing moment was not properly calculated, and as a result, the calculated wind healing moment exceeded the passenger healing. The calculated wind healing moment was then applied to the vessel during the test.
So, based on this flawed test, the Coast Guard issued a stability letter and certificate of inspection to the Fells Point Princess, which allowed the boat to carry up to 25 individuals. Over the next 4 years, the remaining 3 boats in the series were built with the same general layout and dimensions. So, naturally, thinking, if these have sister vessel classification, they don't need to be independently tested and certified because they have the same specifications. But the first 2, the Fells Point Princess and the Raven, had open sides on the deckhouse with no windows. Whereas Lady D and the Misty Harbor 2 had glass windows that we talked about earlier. Which is 2 things. It's going to give you a very different wind profile.
Yes.
And they're a lot heavier.
Despite the design differences, none of the 3 subsequent vessels was subjected to a stability proof test. Rather, they were granted sister vessel status, and each was allowed to carry the same maximum number of persons, 25, as the Fells Point Princess.
While windows versus an open deckhouse might seem a small difference when you're just looking kind of top down at the design, it's really important when you have such a small vessel. A post-accident study estimated that the Lady D's windows and doors added in excess of 400 pounds to the vessel's weight. Going off the average weight calculation that they were using at the time, 140 pounds, this would be the weight of nearly 3 additional passengers. And that's another thing. I think I forgot to add this in here. This is another thing that comes up is that I talked about that kind of series of mistakes. So first off, we have this Fells Point Princess that is tested essentially using the wrong test. So starting from the beginning, we have bad data. And then we take that data and copy it 3 more times to other boats. 2 of those boats are going to behave differently from the first one. So now we have warped an already bad set of data.
That's not good.
This is just the crazy thing about this. The crazy thing about this really is that it didn't happen sooner. That this
was just like waiting to happen. Literally, this was an accident waiting to happen.
Yeah, and that's something that is, kind of pointed out in the report is that it happened to Lady D, but all of these boats were at risk of this happening for the entire time that they operated, because at no point were they being operated safely. They had these limits of 25 when the limit should have been more like 15.
Unsafe at any speed.
Unsafe at any weight.
It's kind of like when you're on a small airplane and they ask people to move around. And it's like, yeah, there's a reason they ask you to do that.
Well, that is quite literally a parallel that's drawn between this story and that plane crash out of, is it Charlotte? I think it was out of, that crashed essentially because of using outdated average weight information estimates. If you estimate that the average American is 140 pounds, the idea used to be that that was the average weight, so it accounted for some heavier people. Some of the people on board are going to be children. So 140 is about average. But as we know, Americans have gotten bigger and heavier over time. So that weight is kind of considered to be very much outdated by the time that this happens. So in the air industry, kind of the same thing happens where that number has to be updated to, I think it's 174 or something.
Mm-hmm.
To more accurately account in these situations where if you cannot get a specific weight, what average should we be working with? Of course, kind of the conclusion you could draw from this is ideally from a safety perspective, every person would get weighed when they enter the boat and they could, say yes or no, you can get on. We're probably not going to do that as a society for, there's other considerations there. But yes, these are the things we sacrifice for living in a society.
We do live in a society.
So ultimately, the NTSB investigation came to the conclusion that 3 major factors led to the sinking of the Lady D.
The Lady D was erroneously granted sister status by the U.S. Coast Guard to a pontoon vessel with different design characteristics.
The Coast Guard certificated the Lady D to carry too many people as a result of an inappropriate stability test on the vessel to which it was granted sister status.
The Coast Guard's regulatory stability test standards, on which the Lady D's passenger allowance was based on an out-of-date passenger.
So yeah, there's that connection to, you have the same issue with small planes. Those relatively small changes in weight can have huge effect on the stability of the vehicle. And that's what we've got here. I'm just flipping back through the conclusions section of the report. Didn't have time to add these to our notes, but a few things here. One suggestion that they had is that masters need a simple and ready means, such as a mark on the hull, to determine whether their vessels are overloaded and potentially unsafe. Essentially, we're talking about a plimsoll line for people.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like we do it on bulk freighters and stuff all the time.
Seems natural that rather than having to do all these calculations, you could just hey, what if we just put something here? That could be a positive change here. Oh, this was one. In the panic situation that ensued after the Lady D capsized, the vessel's normal means of egress from the deckhouse, including the differently designed doors and the slider windows, posed evacuation problems for the vessel's occupants. One factor that was listed by some of the survivors talking about their experience, how did you get out of the boat? And some of them talk about trying to open windows that wouldn't open. And then others talk about pushing windows out quite easily. And so there's this issue where these windows are split in 2, where one pane is movable and one is not. One of the doors also reportedly there was issues with getting it open.
Sounds like just a lot of non-standardized equipment.
It is one of those things where maybe a more detailed or a for sure giving the safety briefing every time, maybe that covers some of those things. So yeah, it is an interesting situation because yes, so many of the people on board do survive. But again, ideally we should be in a situation where everyone has that chance to get out of one of the vessels. Yeah, again, I think the big thing I take from this, though, is that if you're trying to pull a positive from this story, it's that you do have people on hand who, this is not their job, but jumping into action and taking action to literally most definitely save lives. I mean, there's
no doubt about that.
Yeah, there's 3 people who survived this who most likely don't, if not for the actions of those U.S. Navy reservists. On that note, there's an article here in the July 2004 edition of Sea Power titled Baltimore Sea Cadets Cited for Rescue Efforts After Water Taxi Capsizes. 8 cadets from the Baltimore Fort McHenry Division of the U.S. Naval Sea Cadet Corps and 26 Baltimore Navy reservists were cited for valor April 17th by Assistant Secretary of the Navy D.N.L. Aviles for their efforts during the rescue of survivors of a water taxi accident March 6th in Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Naval Reservist and Sea Cadet Lieutenant Commander Art Eisenstein received the Navy Marine Corps Medal for his multiple dives into the water during the rescue mission. Sea Cadets cited during the ceremony were Lieutenant, is JG junior grade? Is that a Navy rank?
Yeah, maybe?
I have no idea. I'll just read their names. Patrick Sullivan, William Trovinger, Renford Smith, Ensign Jerome Stoney, Cadet Anthony Scardina, Petty Officer Second Class Devin Sweet, and Cadet Kathleen Smith.
Yeah, to answer your question, yeah, it's ensign and then lieutenant junior grade.
Oh, cool. The reservists and cadets went to the aid of the passengers who were spilled into the frigid waters of the inner harbor when a sudden microburst thunderstorm overturned their water taxi just off Fort McHenry, and luckily near Naval Reserve Center, Baltimore. Although 3 passengers drowned, 21 others were saved. I think the numbers might be off there. So anyway, that is something that was acknowledged in some of the news articles about this, in addition to linking it to that Charlotte plane crash and how the FAA changed those passenger weight estimates. Another maritime story that it connects to is the tour boat Ethan Allen in New York. And that very quickly changed those weight standards to 174 pounds as the average weight on tour boats on state regulated waterways in New York. So this is an issue that kind of needed to be addressed across different industries, across different states. And it seems, fortunately, it has been addressed more or less. But I think it is kind of a scary story in the sense that this thing had to make it through a lot of filters.
Yeah.
To get to where it was. A lot of people had to overlook things for this boat to get to where it was. And yeah, it's good that we're always catching those types of things, but it is kind of scary to think like, well, what of those things are we currently overlooking?
Yeah, like
right
yeah,
now?
like, what's the current ticking time bomb?
So again, there's a lot more in the reports that we didn't even really get to touch on here. And then almost forgot, but I did want to give a big shout out to our listener Josh, who was the one who suggested this to us. It was quite a while ago at this point, but yeah, just suggesting this as something we could cover, and definitely sounded like something that we wanted to do, especially both of us having at least some experience riding on these Baltimore water taxis.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, we will wrap things up here, and we will talk to you again soon.